thing is that in all these contexts, different elements have different importance, you know. For example, if we take accumulation, quality assurance, credits from learning outcomes and student workload. Both elements are very important. Learning outcomes and workload. While if we take non-formal, informal, and experiential learning, you know, the most important thing is learning outcome. We do not care how long it took the student, how long it took to reach this learning outcome. We compare this of our competences in respect to our formal program and learning outcomes of that program. For recognition, we may say that credits are important from learning outcomes. But for example, for transfer, we can talk about agreed learning outcomes. So what we agreed before, you know. So this is the most important element we are talking about. Now, if we look at how implementation of ECTS is perceived by players on higher education, on European scene, on the higher education. And we look at the stock-taking report of 2009. It's very interesting to observe what they say is that 29 countries implemented credit systems used for transfer and accumulation for all programs. Other countries introduced ECTS for separate programs. Only one-third of the countries linked credits with learning outcomes. Here I want to point your attention to the fact that it's not very clear, when we say one-third of the countries is connected that to learning outcomes. Actually, what learning outcomes on the program and course unit or module level, or just as the kind of, you know, benchmarks for the cycle. It's very difficult, and there could be a lot of confusion when we look to talk about that. Report also says that learning outcomes are confused very often with outcomes of the program, and the main concern is that higher education institutions may learn how to provide technically correct learning outcomes, but do not implement them in reality. So this is the greatest danger. The interesting point I would like to note is that learning outcomes, workload, assessment are reported in completely different sessions than introduction of ECTS, you know, how implementation of ECTS in the countries. And one might ask, okay, is it implementation of ECTS so far away from quality assurance within higher education institutions? It's very interesting, you know. It was very interesting for me to find this out, you know, in this separation. Erasmus Student Union, as one of the main Bologna stakeholders, they produce Bologna of the student eyes. And students, you know, their eyes are very good and very interesting. What they found out and what they said that 62%, they deal in percent, of Bologna signatory countries, ECTS in the law. 26 countries use other credit systems. For the 6 countries, the situation is not clear at all, what is happening in them. And they noted that legal provisions, as a rule, talk of the workload in terms of hours, 1 credit in terms of hours students take. But it does not talk about learning outcomes, and no connection to learning outcomes in most cases. And the dangers that the students have seen is that only 12% of the countries estimate and adapt student workload. Actually, the others, they use credit, but they do not care about it. And it usually depends, of course, on a higher education institution. It is its responsibility. Credits are allocated on the basis of importance or prestige of the course. Contact hours still remain the main method of credit allocation. All credits are converted into ECTS using various formulas, so mechanically, not going into the philosophy of the institution, of the ECTS, and increased student workload. You know, with coming of credit system, they should become normal. It increased. In some other cases, the workload decreased per module, but the number of assessments increased, which is again not really ideal. And rigid implementation of the system, where only 60 credits are allowed, and is seen as a limit for students, neither less nor more. And another stakeholder, the European University Association, they said, yes, in their trend report. Implementation of ECTS continues in European countries, but not all institutions have introduced ECTS in the spirit that guided its recent development. So spirit is what is important. And again, they pointed out to the same, more or less, the same problems as students. They said, okay, its workload is still largely related to contact hours. We found out throughout the institutions, you know. Workload is consistently estimated, is not consistently estimated or measured. Credits are not linked to learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are confused with results achieved for students, and especially with marks and grades. And I would like to say, going through that in my country, a lot of that has to do with the translation of the terms. And if we do not find a proper translation for learning outcome, like in my country, they want on national level to use learning result. That can cause confusion in the future, especially the lower you go with implementation. And recognition of credit is still considered a problem. So, nothing new under the sun, as you see. Now, if we look at this table, it's a table from ECTS Users Guide, and I'm sure 2009. I'm sure everybody has seen that. I'm not going through that. I want again to pay your attention that here we look at how countries introduced, implemented ECTS, and again, it's mostly as a measure of student workload. We cannot see, you know, in these laws or whatever that are quoted about learning outcomes. The interesting thing is to observe that some countries have taken absolute value for a credit, while others use the corridor. The corridor that allows maybe more flexibility and more attention to students' needs to some extent. And the hierarchy of documents, starting with erected conferences, agreements, ministerial decrees, you know, good practice recommendations, and so on. From here, we can derive three basic ways of introduction of ECTS at the national levels. First of all, legal, consensus-based, and recommendation-based. So, if we are talking about legal, it's based on law and on ministerial decrees, and it's a very strong presence of authorities and regulations. And of course, law itself does not guarantee quality of implementation, and even level of implementation. We can scatter, you know, go on the surface with the perfect law. Level of implementation actually depends on precision or prescriptiveness of the legal acts, experience of higher education institutions, traditions, and collaborative, so to say, culture. And if we look at the legislation of, let's say, Scandinavian countries, you will see that the law is very, very wide. It's 60 credits for one academic year, that's about it, you know. And if we look, for example, take the law or Italian law, which is quite prescriptive. It describes every single detail. And why? It's because Scandinavians use credit. They, you know, authorities thought, okay, they're dealing with credit, they know what they're talking about, while in Italy it was closely related to big, you know, national reform of higher education. So the law has been more prescriptive than in any other countries. Consensus-based way is based on rectors, qualification authorities agreements, informal agreements about higher among the higher education institutions. So practically, state authorities are not actively involved in implementing the system, and decisions are being made by the immediate actors, you know, also in higher education. So this is a very, if you would look at how these countries developed, and mainly it is UK, Ireland, so it provides very clear guidance to the institutions on what they agreed. They themselves agreed. And it's a kind of permissive, not prescriptive framework, and which to some extent looks as if it suits institutions very well. Recommendation-based, so not express regulations, no express recommendations. ECTS is seen as good practice, and of course authorities do not interfere with that. And institutions refer directly to European documents. and they tried to introduce ECTS